A warm welcome from the University of Birmingham in the Chamberlain room, which is very appropriate because Joseph Chamberlain was the first chancellor of the university, which was founded in 1900 and was the first civic university in this country that was open to people of all faiths and religions. And if you are living locally or have gone past the university, you're probably familiar with the site of the clock tower that is called Old Joe after Joseph Chamberlain. And this evening we are here with a lot of international experts on Ezra and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I've been hosting a conference with these colleagues at the university, and we've been discussing Ezra and the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly the puzzle that he's never mentioned in the scrolls. But for this evening, we've arranged for you to have three of the very best people talking to you. We've got first Professor Larry Schiffman, who's come all the way from New York University, where he is Judge Abraham Lieberman Professor of Hebrew and Judaic Studies. And he's going to talk about Ezra and the Rabbis in just a second. And after that, we've got Professor Hugh Williamson, who is Regius Professor of Hebrew Emeritus at the University of Oxford. And he was one of the last Regius Professors who actually got a letter from the Prime Minister when he was appointed. And then it was confirmed by the Queen. And the third speaker is also from Oxford, Professor Hindy Najman. And she is Oriel and Lang Professor of Holy Scripture at the University of Oxford. So you've got a real treat coming this evening. Each speaker will speak for about 20 minutes, and after that there will be a chance for you to join the debate and ask some questions. So it's a great pleasure to welcome back to Birmingham Professor Lawrence Schiffman to speak about Ezra and the Rabbis.
Thank you very much. Let me give you an outline as we start out of exactly what we're going to be covering in the next 20 minutes so that you'll be able to follow it. We're going to start with discussing Ezra in Babylonia and the preparation for his role in the land of Israel when he arrives. Then we're going to speak about texts that discusses greatness. All of this is in rabbinic literature. We're simply describing the picture that rabbinic literature gives of Ezra. Greatness of Ezra, Ezra as a kind of new Moses, the decrees of Ezra. Then we're going to get to the question of whether or not Ezra is or is not connected with the so-called men of the Great Assembly. Then we're going to talk about the question of a second Moses and how it relates to the interpreter of the law at Qumran, and then reach some conclusions. I want to start by giving credit to two colleagues, one who I know and one who I don't, who wrote on this topic. Shlomo Zucker, who I had the pleasure of having once as a research assistant, who is doing his dissertation at Yale, has written an article on part of this topic. And Gudrun, I assume it's pronounced Lier, L-I-E-R, from South Africa, has also written a survey on this topic, and both of them were quite helpful to me in preparing my talk. So let's begin here with the fact that Ezra is missing in the chain of tradition in the beginning of the Mishnah Avot. It says there that Moses received the Torah, he passed it on, it gives the different people who received the Torah, until you get to the prophets, and then from the prophets you go immediately from the prophets to the so-called men of the Great Assembly, a supposed group of sages, of which we then learn a little bit later on that the last of them was Shimon the righteous, who lived in about 250 BCE. So this means that right off the bat, we find that just as Ezra is missing in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the fact is that Ezra, in this very important rabbinic statement of the chain of rabbinic authority, is not listed. Now, we will later on discuss the fact that he is probably not part of this great assembly. And the sources we're going to discuss this evening are basically limited to the Mishnah, Tosefta, Babylonian and Palestinian Talmuds. There are some minor midrashim that discuss it. So let's begin with Ezra in Babylon. So first of all, there is a tradition that Ezra did not leave Babylon to come to the land of Israel until the death of Baruch, the son of Neriah. Now, he's a very special person because he is the one person that we know in the Bible is writing editions of a prophet's work. And in fact, we know that he wrote 2 editions of the prophet Jeremiah, so says the Bible. Now, there's no reason to believe that he ever was in Babylonia and that he was actually the teacher of Ezra. But what's being said by this tradition is that Ezra connects directly to the line of the prophets. This differs from Ezra's not being in the list of Avot. It provides a link further of Ezra to the classic rabbinic tradition, which is understood to pass down the words of the prophets. Now, furthermore, there is a statement that in this statement it says that the greatness of the Torah is so much more than even the building of the temple, because they assume that Ezra was a builder of the temple. From a historical point of view, the second temple in its original form was actually not built by Ezra. It was built way after Ezra, but the statement assumes as if he were. Now, then there's another tradition that he didn't live Babylonia until Joshua, the son of Yehozadak, who was the high priest, died. Now, the assumption of this tradition is something different. The assumption of this tradition is that Yehoshua, the son of Yehozadak, would be displaced by Ezra when he arrived. But there is no actual tradition in the Bible that Ezra served as high priest, but there is a statement in some of our sources that he was one of those who performed the ritual of the red heifer. So that would place him, from the rabbi's point of view, as a sort of member of the high priesthood. Now, furthermore, we learn that Ezra also didn't leave Babylonia until he had established the purity of the descent of the Babylonian Jews. From the Talmudic point of view, this was a problem, but what's more important here is that we know that in the actual biblical book of Ezra, Ezra was involved in establishment of the purity of the lineage of Jews who lived in the land of Israel, making the intermarried expel their wives. So it seems that what this tradition wants to tell us is that he himself was totally kosher in terms of his lineage. Now, so he made sure his own status was fine before he came and got involved in the making others pure. And this is a tradition which is, by the way, in the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. Now, he was indeed a priest according to the Bible, so the claim that he may have done the ritual of the Parah Adumah of the red heifer at least has some kind of basis. But there's also a tradition in the Talmud that he pronounced the divine name according to the way it's written, what is called in fancy English the ineffable name. Now, this makes perfect sense because any priest reciting the priestly blessing in the earlier days before the rabbis decided that there shouldn't be, at least they say, we have no idea if this is really what happened, but the rabbinic texts say that the rabbis decided that people should no longer pronounce the divine name, even priests in the temple performing the priestly blessing, because others were hearing it and then using it for magical purpose. Now, furthermore, we have a statement here regarding chronology of when Ezra came. Now, what's not so important to us is the specifics about when he came, which, by the way, from a historical point of view, was under great debate, and its relationship to the coming of Nehemiah is very difficult. But what's significant here is that, again, this particular source, which is found in the Babylonian Talmud, asserts that that he actually came to the land of Israel, and that it was under his authority that the completion of the building of the temple took place. So at any rate, that's Ezra in Babylon and his transfer to the land of Israel according to rabbinic sources. Now we get to the greatness of Ezra. So we're back to the Babylonian Talmud, which tells us that from the death of Moses until the death of Rabbi Judah, the prince who edited the Mishnah, we didn't have Torah and eminence in one place. And then they go and start asking, well, what about this one? What about that one? And the example that's asked for here is, what about Ezra and Nehemiah? So the assumption is that Ezra is the Torah representative, Nehemiah is the representative of greatness, meaning political power. Now here we have an assumption of rabbinic literature that you have a kind of divide between the two of them, and therefore that Ezra and Nehemiah are in the line of what's called in Hebrew the Zugot, the pairs of sages, and that you have one of them who is the Torah sage, that is Ezra, and you have Nehemiah as the kind of more management organizer person. We hear further about Ezra's greatness as a Torah scholar. For example, the statement that Ezra was worthy of having the Torah given through him had not Moses come before him. This is already verging on this idea that Ezra is a sort of second Moses. The Jerusalem Talmud also tells us some very interesting thing. The Bible says he was a scribe. However, they say here he's not only a scribe in the words of the Torah, but he's also a scribe in the words of the sages, meaning that he was understood to be expert not only in the written Torah, but in the developing oral Torah already. Now, this is very important because this places him in the line of Torah scholars, and what's happening in a lot of these sources is that he's being declared to be such a scholar. Now, I just want to point out in parentheses here that there are some sources that talk about a Torah scroll of Ezra. This never existed and is in actuality a mistake, for the Torah scroll of the Azarah, which is a temple courtyard, where Torah scrolls were kept to be able to correct other scrolls in their light. Now, furthermore, to tell his greatness in Torah, we learn that Hillel was himself a student of Ezra. Now, this is not a historical statement. What it means to say is that in the line of sages that come one after another and after another, right? When Hillel died, they said, we have to mourn Hillel because he was, in fact, a student of Ezra, meaning that he was such a great man that Hillel was able to take that Torah of Ezra. Now remember that Hillel came from Babylonia, as did Ezra. So Hillel and Ezra had a similar career. Each came to the land of Israel, and each came with great Torah knowledge. Now also, we have a statement that he was the author of his own book, which seems to include Nehemiah, and also of Chronicles. Then there's a question about, wait a minute, who finished the book? Because in the book he provides his genealogy, but like Moses, to whom he's often compared, as we're going to go on, like Moses, he died before his book was completed. So the Talmud asked who completed it. The answer is Nehemiah. Now, this is a very important point because this particular text in the Talmud in Bava Batra goes through and tells us all of who wrote what book. Now, we don't know what the word wrote means. Does it mean edited this biblical book? Does it mean composed? But leave that problem aside for now, because it can't be solved, by the way. And what we see in this text is something interesting, because we hear that the men of the great assembly wrote, in quotes, Ezekiel and the 12 prophets. And then, as distinguished from them, Ezra wrote his book. So this is another little piece in the argument that the Talmud actually does not place Ezra with the men of the great assembly. That's a medieval idea. We also hear that when Ezra came back to the land of Israel, he began to lead the intercalation of the calendar, the calculation of the Jewish calendar based on the new moon and making it move together with the solar cycles. Now this is here also implies something else. The idea is that when everyone, which by the way, everyone never was in exile, but when everyone was in exile, right, because the land of Israel was not empty, but when they were all in the Babylonian exile, the assumption is that there they had to do their own calendar work rather than in the land of Israel. When Ezra came back, the Talmud tells us he took over the calculation of the calendar. Now the theme of Ezra as the new Moses is found in the Tosefta, which is one of your earliest rabbinic sources. And what happens is we begin with the statement that Ezra was worthy that the Torah be given by him, had Moses not preceded him. And then we go on here with a whole bunch of explanations about how the verb Allah, to go up, is used of both of them. And that's why they're parallel. But then we learn some other really interesting things. We learn here that Ezra was responsible for the fact that the eventual authoritative Torah was written in the script, what's called Assyrian script, or Aramaic script, or square script, or Jewish script, which is the Hebrew script that we're used to. And the decision that that would be the case, as opposed to the old Canaanite script, was made by Ezra. But at the same time, there's the peculiar statement that Ezra also made the Torah in Aramaic. What it refers to it's not that the Torah as a whole became an Aramaic scroll, but it refers to the fact that under Ezra, according to these traditions, the translation of the Torah into Aramaic, which became normative for Jews in many countries, still done by the Yemenite Jews in Israel, and this system of translating the Torah as being read would happen as a regular practice. Now, that statement also, that entire same stuff is found as well in the Jerusalem Talmud. Now, also very important is the idea that Ezra instituted public Torah reading. Now, specifically, according to these traditions, it's believed that Moses instituted the weekly portion, and Ezra instituted, depending on where you look, either Monday and Thursday reading, or Monday, Thursday, and Shabbat reading. But anyhow, this is all based on the description of the public reading of the Torah in Nehemiah 8 to 10, which is a very important aspect of this whole notion of Ezra's importance as a Torah scholar. So as I mentioned, he is understood to be responsible for the change of the script. There are two views about the change of the script. We can't go into this in too much detail. One view is that the script was changed twice. No scholar, modern scholar, historian would agree with this, but it does. There's an argument in the Talmud. One view says that nobody would agree with the first view, which says that the Torah was originally given in square script, then was changed to Canaanite script, then was changed back to square script under Ezra. Virtually all scholars assume that the Torah originally circulated in Canaanite script, which is an angular script that used to be used. And then under Ezra, or at the time, the Second Temple, somehow or another, that was changed, and the Talmud completely attributes this to the work of Ezra. Again, we have this in both the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmuds, and in every one of them, he is being compared with Moses, who had created the initial Torah text, and be it in whichever script it was created in. Now, Ezra is also understood to be a restorer of the temple, of the Torah. The Babylonian Talmud tells us that the Torah was forgotten until the time that Ezra came back from Babylonia and he reestablished it. And then they further tell us it was forgotten again, and Hillel reestablished it again. Hillel the Babylonian, the sage that came from Babylonia, being pictured as parallel. Very important are Ezra's decrees. Ezra is known to have made a whole bunch of decrees. Let me just read the 10 as they exist. So that portions of Scripture should be read at the Saturday afternoon prayer, on Monday and Thursdays also. The court should be open on Mondays and Thursdays. Clothes should be washed on Thursdays for the honor of the Sabbath. Garlic should be eaten on the eve of the Sabbath. That's supposed to create interest in sexual activity. A woman should do her baking early in the morning so as to have fresh bread for the poor who should ask for it. A woman should wear a type of underwear, but I'm not sure if it's underwear or overwear. It's called a sinar, which means an apron, but it's meant to create modesty in the upper part of her body. A woman should comb her hair before immersing in the ritual bath. Vendors should travel from town to peddle their wares unmolested, and all the commentaries explain that this refers to selling makeup for women. He also enacted immersion in the ritual bath for men who had seminal emissions. That is itself a very complicated topic and would be a long discussion. Now, the question that we have to talk about now is this association of Ezra with the men of the Great Assembly, which is common in medieval sources and has become a kind of article of faith of modern historical study, because it was pushed greatly by Louis Finkelstein, also Hugo Mantel, who's less important. But these scholars argued that basically Nehemiah 8 to 10 is the founding, where they had this public Torah reading and public ceremony of accepting the covenant, is the founding, so to speak, of this great assembly. And this group functioned according to the understanding. By the way, two separate questions. There's a whole question about, we have no external sources for it. And what was it and how did it function in that period? But the question that I am arguing against now is the notion that Ezra was part of it, or at least in rabbinic sources. He could have been part of it, but it's not in any of the Talmudic sources. So the reason for this, by the way, they were 120 sages, according to one account, in this great assembly, and that's the pattern for the Israeli Knesset, having 120 representatives. Maybe if they followed the other Talmudic account, that you only have to have 85, they could solve the coalition problem. Now, at any rate, this refers to the way in which these sages, whoever they were, seemed to be the dominant force between the end of the storyline of the Bible, which ends the storyline in about 450 BCE, and the 250 BCE Shimon the Righteous, who's said to be the last of this group. Now, the point that I want to make here is that when you look at the various sources, none of these sources actually mentions Ezra being part of the group. They mention the last prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. They mention Mordechai, from the story of the Megillah Esther, and also their associates or scholars along with them. So it seems that the only way to understand why the medieval scholars eventually concluded that Ezra was part of this group is a kind of funny way. It's because there is a passage in the Babylonian Talmud that tries to claim that Ezra is actually the same person as Malachi the prophet. Now what's funny about this is that first the Talmud tries to claim that Mordechai from the story of Esther is the guy. He is Malachi. And then they say, no, it's really not him, right? That maybe it's Ezra. And then this idea is defeated in the Talmud argumentation. Despite that fact, it could be that that was the source for the medievals, because if he is Malachi, there are statements that Malachi was part of the Great Assembly. We have no other direct rabbinic sources, so I'm not telling you whether he was or was not part of the Great Assembly. I'm telling you that rabbinic sources of the Talmudic period do not say he was, and that medieval and modern scholars have come to conclude that he really was. And this is basically an article of faith in a lot of history books. And many of us were taught this as kids, but we have no way to know this. Now, what about now Ezra as a second Moses? So this is a point where there may be a parallel with the Dead Sea Scrolls. We actually had a presentation about this today, because in the Dead Sea Scrolls there occur a few times references to an interpreter of the law who would be a kind of officially designated student and perhaps could be the leader who would teach Torah to the rest of the sectarians. So we saw that this term could refer either to someone just studying, it could refer to a past great teacher, and it could, in several passages, refer to a messianic figure who would be a teacher of Torah. There's no question in my mind that there does lurk behind this, even though it's never said or spoken, something pertaining to this idea of Ezra, who appears as a kind of second Moses, teacher of Torah. And there are various scholars who try to explain the interpreter of the law in the Dead Sea Scrolls as a kind of second Moses. Now, let me now therefore summarize what I said and be able to conclude exactly on time. Now, basically, the rabbis valued the role of Ezra tremendously. They saw him as a link between biblical and post-biblical Judaism. Basically, they understood that Bible tradition evolved into the eventually Pharisaic and rabbinic tradition. They saw the entire thing as a continuity and Ezra as a binder, so to speak, between those two, not just a transitional figure, but a figure who made that connection and made that connection permanent. It seems that modern scholars basically, in many cases, agree with this. And part of the reason for this is because much of the rabbinic view is itself an expansion on what the Bible says about Ezra. So what they do is they take the biblical story of Ezra, so to speak, and they sort of transition him into being a full-fledged Torah scholar who therefore can function to represent the passing on of the tradition between the prophets and this apparent great assembly that the Talmud speaks about, apparently in their view, as coming after Ezra. This doesn't change the fact that the authoritative chain of tradition in Avot 1:1 skips him. So it seems like we have two views. One, that he was not such a significant figure in the passing on of the tradition, and that the tradition would have gone ahead to the next stage without him. And one that makes him the great Torah scholar who should be credited with the passing on of the tradition from the biblical period to post-biblical. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. What I should have said at the beginning, and I forgot, is for the sake of people who can't be with us today, we're recording this. I don't think the audience is in the picture, but I meant to say that at the beginning. Our second speaker now is Professor Hugh Williamson, and he will speak about the question of whether Ezra is the founder of Judaism. Thank you very much.
Good evening, and it's a privilege to be with you all. When I retired 5 years ago, one of the duties that I was happiest to give up was examining. At the end of their 3 or 4 years studying Hebrew and Aramaic, our undergraduates had to sit many 3-hour papers on texts from all the main periods of Hebrew down to the modern day. They had to be able to answer questions on philology and textual criticism, as well as on the content of the books in question from both literary and historical perspectives. The 9th paper that they sat, however, was called the General Paper, a choice of essays on a wide selection of questions on biblical, medieval and modern topics, as well as some questions that tried to draw the whole thing together. I remember once, for instance, setting the question, could Isaiah understand the Haaretz newspaper? So, in other words, the relation between classical and modern Hebrew. Another that came up from time to time was precisely the question that we're going to consider briefly this evening: was Ezra the father of Judaism? And as you might expect me to say, it all depends on what you mean by Judaism, and also what you think we know historically about Ezra. So let me start by drawing up my terms of reference. The question of the history of ancient Israel and Judah has been going through an extremely turbulent period during the last 20 or 30 years. While some on the extreme right still maintain that everything happened precisely as it's described in the Hebrew Bible, others on the extreme left have argued that we know more or less nothing at all about the so-called kingdoms of Israel and Judah down to the time of the Babylonian exile, that all the literature which we have now in our Bibles comes from after that date, and that the only secure historical source that we have comes from archaeology, not from the Bible at all. By the way, I ought to explain that when I talk about the extreme right and the extreme left, this has no bearing whatever on the current election campaign. Now, obviously, I can't go into the details of this debate now, but I must indicate that, as you would expect, I take something of a middle position in all these debates. That is to say, while adopting what I anyway think is a responsible, critical position, I'm less sceptical than some about our ability to salvage a good deal of earlier history from our texts, even while I agree wholeheartedly that, of course, these texts were not written, actually, for narrowly historical purposes in the first place. So we're trying to recover history from texts whose purpose may have been different. And that means that over the course of the centuries, sometimes we just need to be reminded of what a long period we're talking about here. Over the centuries that the Hebrew Bible covers, many social and political changes inevitably took place. And of these, I want to single out one here that has had lasting consequences for the religious history of the world. How did it come about that the national religion of a minor ancient Near Eastern state, one among many that could be compared, such as the national religions of Edom or Moab or Aram, how is it that this one endured, in admittedly a vastly changed manner, to become the Judaism in its various forms with which we are familiar from later centuries, which has given birth in turn to 2 other major great world religions, and which has thrived for some 2 millennia in a diaspora community unrelated to a sovereign state and without major political significance? The other disputed element in my title, of course, is Ezra. Scholars argue about his date. A few deny that he ever existed, and many who think he did regard the texts about him as being deeply unreliable. In the Bible, it's primarily Ezra chapters 7 to 10, and then Nehemiah chapter 8. Now, at this point, for reasons I've argued at length elsewhere, I actually become very conservative. to the despair of my friends and colleagues. On another occasion we could discuss all that, but for this evening I want to suggest that it needn't matter too much. We certainly have a literary figure called Ezra. And of course there are several other books called Ezra which were written later and which never came near to making it into the Bible. Now, if you agree with me about the history, well and good. But if you don't, I invite you simply to substitute the literary figure called Ezra every time I mention Ezra by name. And I think that will suffice for present purposes. Now, from whatever angle we approach the details of the case, the circumstances we're talking about relate roughly to the middle or late 5th century BCE. At that time, Judah was a very small province in the satrapy of beyond the river in the mighty Persian Empire, which stretched all the way from India to Egypt. The size of Judah was much reduced from the pre-exilic kingdom of the same name, and the population has been estimated variously, but somewhere around 20,000 people. I mean, this is not very big. Though the temple had been rebuilt in Jerusalem, the political centres of administration were at Mizpah a little to the north and Ramat Rachel a little to the south. The province did not lie on any major international route, so that it held little strategic importance for the imperial power. The precise extent of its self-governance, how much control did it have over its own affairs, is a matter of dispute, but everyone agrees that it was certainly limited by the overriding authority of Persia, and of course taxes had to be paid to the Persian state. Religion will have been focused on the family on the one hand, and the temple on the other. But at the same time, we should not forget that there continued to be an important community in Babylon of those who had not returned to the land, and that they had long been wrestling with the question of how to maintain their religion as a strong mark of social identity once they were cut off from the institutions that had given birth to that religion in what we now sometimes call the Holy Land. All the leaders of Judah of which we have records came to Jerusalem from Babylon, and of course Babylon remained as a leading centre of Judaism for many centuries after, as we've already heard from Professor Schiffman. The problem that this small community faced in Judah was that the political and social circumstances in which all the earlier literature had been written had changed quite radically. Now, in some cases, like the Psalms or the wisdom literature, Proverbs and so on, that didn't make much difference. In the case of the law, however, there was clearly the danger that much of it had now become completely outdated and irrelevant to the present situation. It's true that the narrowly priestly material, how to do sacrifices and that, which in any case was probably the last to be codified, that continued to be relevant to the administration of the cult in the temple. But that could not apply to much of what we find in the so-called covenant code in Exodus 20 to 23 and in Deuteronomy. Laws, guidelines, instruction, call it what you will, framed for an independent society with its own sovereign form of government, was no longer so easily or directly applicable. Consequently, as has happened with all comparable law codes throughout history, the text was becoming a museum piece that from a practical point of view could simply be ignored. And the claim that I want to make at this point is that in the text that we have available to us now, it's in the narratives about Ezra that we first find an attempt to address this conundrum in a fresh manner. In the story that we have, Ezra comes to Jerusalem from Babylon and instigates a teaching program related to the law. That sounds innocent enough, but it conceals a matter of far greater moment. What we see is not simply an attempt to apply the law which might have been neglected in the meantime. Rather, we find an approach to interpretation a hermeneutic, if you like fancy words, that completely reworks the law at its surface level in order to get at what we might like to call its spirit, in a way that moves in the direction of timeless relevance. Now, this can be done in several ways. The attempt to read several passages harmonistically is in some ways the most complicated, but is equally the most significant, probably. The standout example, which has already been discussed in our conference, actually, by others, is in Ezra chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, where an argument is advanced to justify opposition to mixed marriages. It starts with a reference to the stereotypical list of indigenous peoples of the land, Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, and so on, who, of course, were no longer around at this time. Whether or not they ever were previously, I don't go into, but they certainly weren't now. It would therefore have been easy for somebody reading that part of the law to say that none of that's applicable because they're not the people that we have now. But in fact, what we find is that they begin to be applied to a group called the people of the land. What is more, the Torah, the law, nowhere bans marriage to foreigners without exception. It's not a blanket rule, and of course many of the famous figures in the Bible were actually married to, quotes, foreigners. However, in the rest of the passage, several scattered points of reference are brought together in a way which leads to the conclusion that the present community should keep itself pure from such marriages. Avoidance of marriages in the law that might lead people away from their faith in Exodus and Deuteronomy. The promise of seed to Abraham, the patriarch, is linked with the Deuteronomic concept of Israel as a holy people, so that you get a holy seed bringing those two notions together, and most tellingly of all, the prohibition of mixing unlike animals, crops, or materials, which comes in Leviticus, same verb is used, in order to maintain what I regard as a form of racial purity. Now, it's not my purpose to try and unravel further or to justify the stance that's taken. What matters is the way in which several elements from the Torah are clearly intertwined to arrive at a ruling which is not itself previously attested, but which seeks to update the law in such a way as to make it relevant in the new and changed circumstances of the community. Another way to approach this same ideological development is to look at several places in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah where something is said to be done as it is written, Hebrew kakatuv. This has often been misunderstood to refer to everything that comes before it, and so to imply, and some scholars have tried to argue, that the written Torah was actually different from the Torah they were dealing with in those days. But in fact, I've tried to show elsewhere that the phrase consistently refers to only the words that immediately precede it, which all do come in the Torah, we know, and that the remainder is an additional interpretation or explanation to make it possible to keep the law in changed circumstances. Here's a very simple example. Nehemiah 10, verse 34, we read this. We have also cast lots among the priests, the Levites, and the people for the wood offering, to bring it to the house of our God by ancestral houses at appointed times, year by year, to burn on the altar of the Lord our God, as it is written in the law. Now, you can look anywhere you like in the Bible, and you won't find any law that commands people to make a wood offering. It's just not there. In Leviticus 6, however, it is commanded that the fire on the altar of sacrifice should be kept burning continually. And that's what the words, as it is written, refer to. You must keep that fire burning. All the rest about having a rotation, a rota to bring wood to make sure it does, are practical arrangements to ensure that the written law, that you must have a fire burning, to ensure it's kept. It's the start of the movement towards what later on is called sometimes the concept of the fence around the Torah. You keep lots of other laws to make sure that the real law is never broken. Other examples of ways in which laws begin to be conflated or interpreted in the light of each other could easily be brought, but it's not necessary. I can summarize my case as follows. After the fall of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, the end of the royal dynasty of David, and the exile of the leading members of the population to Babylon, the law as it then existed became unenforceable and outdated. It stood on the brink of becoming a document of solely antiquarian interest. In Babylon, the community had already begun to devise strategies whereby religious identity could be maintained despite the loss of all the institutions which had previously maintained it as a national or state religion. The example I sometimes give is, have any of you ever been abroad when it's the Queen's birthday, if you're English like me, and you get invited to the embassy, and you do things at the British embassy on the Queen's birthday that you never would do at home, but, you know, are archetypically British, and you have strawberries and cream on the lawn, and you drink champagne, and you salute the flag, or whatever it might be. When you're in a foreign place, the institutions aren't there, but you devise strategies to maintain your curious, in this case, English identity. Recent social scientific approaches have analysed some of the techniques by which this is done. And as is so often the case in the religious life, the law began to be interpreted in ways which lent legitimacy to the social practices that developed. So necessity drives you to adopt practices, and then you try and find a law that backs it up. So far as our evidence goes, the successful leadership in Judah all came from Babylon, and from this source, strategies of adaptation to changed circumstances will have been imposed or at least implemented. Rather than being in itself a source for instruction, the law became a tool to be used as a venerable authority to justify the formation of a community in continuity, but in many ways even greater discontinuity with that which had prevailed before the exile. So far as our texts go, that movement in the use and interpretation of the law was the achievement of a character called Ezra. My conservative inclinations thus allow me to conclude that Ezra could indeed be called, therefore, the father of Judaism, since we may trace a direct line from his hermeneutic, which I've just touched on, through to the varying forms of Judaism of which we know in later centuries. But if my moderate conservatism causes you to despair, perhaps at least we can agree that the path I have sketched must have begun somehow at roughly the same time, that we see evidence for it in the texts which have reached us, and that remarkably, if that had not been the case, we should have today been talking of the religion of ancient Judah as being as much of a dead letter as the ancient religion of Moab, Ammon, and Edom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a real feast this evening, and we're going to have a presentation as well. And we're just going to move this lecture a bit. And our final speaker this evening is Professor Hindy Najman, and she will speak about Ezra the prophet in 4th Ezra between Judaism and Christianity.
Thank you. What an honor it is to be here. I take it upon myself, because I'm the third of three small talks, just to honor and thank Professor Hempel for a remarkable and illuminating conference, and for her vision, both for our students here in the UK, our postgraduate students, but also for a community of intellectuals that are well beyond the academy. And this is really characteristic of you, Charlotte, and the work that you do in Jewish studies, in biblical studies, and in the humanities more generally. So thank you. I am so honored to follow my two teachers and scholars and colleagues, Hugh Williamson and Larry Schiffman. And tonight, my assignment is to think not only about Judaism, but also about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and the legacy of Ezra. And I'm going to focus on a particular text called Fourth Ezra, which is shared in legacy and in translation and in inheritance in Judaism, in Christianity, and also translated into Arabic in an Islamic context. So the beginning of my assignment is really to ask why Ezra, this Ezra about whom you've heard a lot about, would be memorialized in the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, the Old Testament, as a priest and as a scribe. Why would he be remembered in these later texts as a prophet? Now, you might have already figured this out with Professor Schiffman's talk when he talked about, and also Professor Williamson, as, Ezra as a new Moses. But Ezra is a biblical figure whose period coincides more or less with the so-called end of prophecy in Judaism. The familiar story reports that prophecy ended with the Second Temple prophets, and this is reflected in various writers, Josephus, First Maccabees, as well as in the rabbinic collection called Tosefta, and that's the first text in your handout. Misha Metu Nevi'im Achronim, Chagai Zechariah Malachi, Pascha Ruach HaKodesh Mi Yisrael. And this is the first text on your handout. Ezra the scribe is likened to none other than Moses, reminding us, for example, of Deuteronomy 34. There isn't another like Moses. Text 2 on your handout was already cited by Professor Schiffman. That Ezra was sufficiently worthy, the Hebrew which you have in front of you is ra'ui, right? It's worthy, that the Torah could have been given through him if Moses had not preceded him. So the reputation and transformation of Ezra across the biblical tradition defies the discourse, of course, of the end of prophecy, and in fact even names Ezra as a prophet. I'm going to talk about this text in a few minutes, but let's just take a quick look at this. This is a story, I'm going to talk about this text in a little bit, called Fourth Ezra, which is a retelling of Ezra having experienced the destruction, and the people are waiting for him to come back. He's getting a revelation from God or from the Most High through an angel Uriel, and this is in the middle of the next text on your handout, text 3. Just take a look at verse 42. The children of Israel, or the Judahites, the people that are left in Israel, are waiting for him. 7 days passed. We know the story about 40 days passed, and he comes back. And they're asking him, how long can you keep us? For you, O Ezra, they say, you are left to us out of all the prophets, like a great cluster from the harvest, like a lamp in a dark place, like the harbor of life to a ship which is standing in a storm. Or aren't the evils that happened to us sufficient, or are you too going to leave us? For if you leave us, it would have been better that we also would have been burnt in the burning of Zion. So here, this is a text, right? This text called Fourth Ezra is one of the works that was copied and considered holy, as I already mentioned, by the Christians. Certainly it had a legacy. It was produced by Jews in the aftermath of the destruction, not of the first temple, but of the second temple. We have copies of this text in Syriac, the earliest from the famous Ambrosiana Codex, currently housed in Milan. We have copies in Latin. It claims to be written in the aftermath, which you might have all guessed, of the first temple, the destruction of the first temple. And we know that it's written, however, after the destruction of the second temple. Now, this is already going to make a lot of sense to you because of what you heard from Larry Schiffman and from Hugh Williamson. The story about a new Torah continues about a new presentation or a representation of the law in later religious communities. It's a text which speaks both to Judaism and its growth and interpretive vitality, in the aftermath of a temple, and to a vibrant and emerging Judaism in a nascent early Christianity in the first century of the Common Era. This is a text which preserves liturgical and interpretive readings that will find later expressions in Judaism and in Christianity. So although it was composed in the first century of the Common Era amidst tremendous crisis, Fourth Ezra performs this crisis, loss of faith, recovery, and hope, as though it was written in the aftermath of the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE. So, this seems like nothing else but a forgery or a lie. Why claim that this work is written by someone when it was not? First, the practice of this kind of attribution to grow a tradition connected to Moses, connected to Ezra, connected to Jeremiah, is a well-known and established practice in ancient Judaism and early Christianity. It's not a lie, but it's a way of growing a tradition linked to a founder. But in addition to that, why choose Ezra? Why choose Ezra, the person who was responsible for rebuilding the Second Temple? Why identify with Ezra as a way of returning to a pre-destruction time? Well, one could say that the Second Temple is not yet built, so it's as though the destruction didn't even happen yet. But it's a work that performs the past, present, and future all in a single text. So it both reminds us of a past, it promises a new future, a new law, which we're going to talk about, as well as a recovery period, all in a single moment, a single interpretive moment, as it thinks and rethinks Ezra's legacy, both with respect to the history of new law, of reestablishment of new community, and fundamentally the recovery of a lost relationship with God. So, Fourth Ezra comes to represent a text in which we can speak about Judaism and Christianity as religious or religious traditions that are intimately separate. In Fourth Ezra, the protagonist has no difficulty in explaining the destruction of the temple. Like Adam's expulsion from the garden and like the flood, it's a punishment incurred by human disobedience. And yet, Ezra nevertheless asks very challenging questions of God. Like Job, Ezra laments the day of his birth. However, taking an approach that differs from Job's, Ezra's questions are twofold. First, Ezra asks why God has allowed human beings to sin and thereby incur punishment when God could have intervened to remove the source of disobedience, concerning the time of the giving of the Torah of Sinai. And that's text 4 on your handout. You didn't remove the evil heart in order that your law would produce fruits in them. We're going to come back to this text in a little bit. The justice of punishment is not questioned, but the rationale for God's governance of the world is mysterious. Second, Ezra asks why Israel is collectively punished by the destruction of the temple. What's the meaning of the everlasting covenant with Jacob? If the temple has been destroyed, and furthermore, why does Babylon now dominate Israel if Babylon is no less sinful? No nation is perfect, but is any nation more obedient than Israel? These are challenging questions, and they must surely have been on the minds of Fourth Ezra's intended readers. In addition to Job, Ezra is also reminiscent of Abraham, who argued with God over the city of Sodom in Genesis 18, an episode to which Ezra in Fourth Ezra explicitly refers. Indeed, Ezra considers himself to be in the long tradition of those who, like Abraham, prayed for the collective that includes the unrighteous. And here in text 5 on your handout is one of Ezra's pleas with God, and I've also put it on the PowerPoint. A well-known rabbinicist, Daniel Boyarin, many years ago, in the 1970s actually, suggested that this passage from text 5 on your handout resonates strongly with a very early liturgical example of the slichot, of penitential prayers, which are said to this very day around the time of the period of the Day of Atonement in Judaism, a text called Megillat Ta'anit, but there are many iterations of this text. And that is, by the way, text 6 on your handout. And for those of you that read Hebrew, I also put the Hebrew text in front of you. I'm going to let you read it while I talk a little bit about it. This is the basis for one of the 4 elements of this repentance liturgy, slichot, the remainder comprising the recitation of 13 attributes of divine mercy, confession, and pleading, tachanun. With the exception of the latter, Boyarin has argued that these remaining elements are also to be found already in this text of Fourth Ezra. So Ezra continues pleading for the people in what resembles the rabbinic formula for confession, and it begins an appeal to divine attributes. Take a look at text 7 on your handout. For we and our fathers have passed our lives in ways that bring death, but you, because of us, sinners, are called merciful. Whether, as has been suggested, that the author of Fourth Ezra is alluding in a literary fashion to a liturgy that was already present in the first century of the Common Era, or whether the text reflects scripturally rooted elements of a prayer that does not yet constitute a liturgy, it's impossible to determine. What's clear, however, is that the seeds of repentance liturgy, both for Judaism and in Christianity, are already present in this text. Let's talk a little bit about the parting of the ways. Fourth Ezra repeatedly claims that the scriptures are no longer accessible. And this, of course, is in response to the destruction. Not only is the temple destroyed, but the texts of the temple are destroyed. Ultimately, the Torah is destroyed in Ezra's text. The attitudes of scholars towards this inaccessibility have been determined to a large extent by their own religious expectation. That is, scholars who view 4th Ezra in the context of a story whose culmination is the development of Christianity have tended to regard the losing of Scripture or the inaccessibility of Scripture as an expression of rupture in God's covenant with Israel. To a large extent, this reading relies heavily on text 8 in your handout, and also now on the board. And the holy laws at the end of this passage, and the holy laws of our fathers were nullified, and the written covenants were no more. Now, it's certainly possible to read this passage in a way that replaces Judaism and with Christianity, a supersessionist way. Through sin, the Torah was nullified because the covenant was broken. And if the covenant was to be renewed, it had to be renewed in a new way, perhaps with a new group. Certainly the language of the nullification of the law could not be more repellent to the rabbinic mind. Approximately 1,000 years after the destruction of the Second Temple, Maimonides would use exactly such language in his code to express the Christian and Islamic view, holding which would constitute, quote, the denial of the Torah, unquote. He who says that the Creator changed one commandment for another, and that this Torah, although of divine origin, is now annulled, in Maimonides' language, batla Torah zu, as the Hagarites and the Nazarites assert, etc., etc., they are the people that are deny the Torah. Assumptions formed by Christianity have also led scholars to read the protagonist's diagnosis of the crisis in the passage we just read, in particular, as the idea of an evil heart, first exhibited by Adam as an expression of the Christian doctrine of original sin. In contrast, right, so there are all these views that read this text as a fulfillment of early Christianity. But in contrast, scholars who approach the text from a Jewish perspective, of whom there have been far fewer, since 4th Ezra was not preserved in its Hebrew original, will tend to emphasize the regiving of the Torah at the end of the book of 4th Ezra as a renewal of the old covenant with Israel, focusing not on temple but on text. They will tend to interpret the protagonist's talk of an evil heart as anticipating the rabbinic views concerning the evil disposition, the Yetzer Hara. Moreover, perhaps more importantly, 4th Ezra will become one of the most important precedents for the authorization of the rabbinic oral Torah, Torah Sheba'al Peh, a doctrine in light of the 70 esoteric books that are said to be revealed at the end of the final vision of 4th Ezra. At the end of the vision, the Torah is given again, the exoteric, what we would call today the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, plus a whole host of esoteric texts. There's enormous debate what these texts are. Right? People have associated with the book of Revelation. People have associated with specific tractates in the history of rabbinic thinking. In my view, the readings of 4th Ezra as rabbinic or as Christian both use anachronism in the wrong way. And this is why I called this section Before the Parting of the Ways. I'd like to avoid imposing onto ancient Jewish contemporary conceptions of authorship or attribution, or generally conceptions that consider attribution primarily as a way of staking claims in the marketplace. Instead, we should use anachronism, what Friedrich Nietzsche called untimeliness, in a fruitful way, to raise questions about a text that its own writers and immediate readers would not or could not have asked, and to raise questions about our own time today that we would not or could not have asked. So it's here. 4th Ezra was written before the divide between Judaism and Christianity. This is why I think it can participate in both discourses, in both lines of thinking. Even according to the parting of the ways, this is a literature that's been underway for well over 30 years, scholars who are debating when does the parting actually start. For example, Paul's writing, right, or the early Jesus sayings, or the Dead Sea Scrolls. To what extent are they generative both for Judaism and Christianity, or only Judaism or Christianity? In any event, it points to a period, certainly this text of 4th Ezra, somewhere between 70 and 135 CE, as the decisive period as a break, a point that is under debate. 4th Ezra precedes a complete division. We should not expect its positions on covenant or the source of evil, original sin, to be exactly the same as any that are found in either tradition later on. But we should not and cannot liberate ourselves entirely from our own historical position, any more than we can or should step out of our own skins. Instead, we should expect some commonalities between 4th Ezra and both Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity, and the contrast and comparison may be mutually illuminating. How then are we to understand 4th Ezra 4:23? and the holy laws of our fathers were nullified and the written covenants were no more. Well, much depends on our own expectations of these texts. Much depends also on the way in which 4th Ezra is read as a unit or part of a unit or composed of distinct units. 2 preceding chapters in the Latin edition, so at 4th Ezra isn't only its own text, but it gets written and rewritten, and it actually gets expanded in Christian traditions. There is this growth in the Christian tradition and the Latin tradition where confessors are mentioned as the sons of God. 2 succeeding chapters in the Latin, known as 6th Ezra, as I already mentioned, appear very, very familiar to the book of Revelation and seem to allude to Roman persecution of Christians. In this context, the nullification of the Torah goes along with the transfer of the covenant from the old Israel to the church as the new Israel. But these 4 chapters are clearly Christian additions, and 4th Ezra has also been preserved without these additions. Can 4th Ezra, once it's dislodged from Christian editions, still sustain a reading which offers a replacement of Christianity from Judaism? I gave you on text 9 one such reading, which I'm not going to read, I'm just going to leave with you, a reading which depends on disrupting the unity of the text in order to secure a particularly Christian reading of this text as original sin. This scholar, E.P. Sanders, would have to hold not only that the conclusion of 4th Ezra, where there's new law given and interpretation of that law, is a mere addition to the text and not part of its unity, but also that the other passages that seem to cohere with Judaism of the time are there to save the text. 2 such examples are on your handout, and this is text 10 and text 11. And answering, this is text chapter 7, verse 10. I said to him, "Is it thus, Lord? Is this the way it is?" asked Ezra. And God answered and said to me, "It is with the portion of Israel, for because of them I made the world. And when Adam transgressed my commandments, the thing that was created was condemned." And then text 11. But our fathers received the law and didn't keep it. They received the commandments and they didn't do them. They had the fruits of your law that did not perish. For they are not able to perish because it is of you. And this is an account in the 9th chapter, which is actually the 4th vision of 4th Ezra, where the law is said never to have perished. So it's re-revealed at the end, but it can't be perished. So you see how they're different kind of what we would call theological positions in tension with each other, embedded within a single text that's composed in the aftermath of the destruction of the Second Temple, claiming to be part of a much earlier history. In my view, the second passage from this slide here, the second one here from chapter 9, is a particularly transformative moment. The claim in the passage is as follows: if the Torah is of God, then it can't perish. Ezra here recognizes that while the Torah may have been burnt and rendered inaccessible on earth, it can yet be renewed and made accessible once more. So the distinction of the scholar I mentioned early, E.P. Sanders, between those parts that are naive and merely there to make the text palatable to Jewish circles, and the presumably more sophisticated elements that are genuinely constituents of its unity, depend entirely on E.P. Sanders' own theological assumptions. In particular, he assumed that a certain position, according to which the righteous of Israel are saved, is less sophisticated than one according to which the righteous of all nations are saved without regard to the election of Israel. While this is certainly debatable within theology, and it has been debated much in recent centuries, it's not an adequate basis on which to distinguish essential from accidental elements of the text. The idea is that Israel was chosen by God, and this election has special implications of some sort for salvation. This is generally assumed by ancient Jewish texts, and even, indeed, by some early Christian texts. One aspect of 4th Ezra's strategy, then, is its portrayal of the scriptural tradition as destroyed. Only at the culmination of the book will it be renewed, re-given, a new law. And again, you've heard both Professor Schiffman and Professor Williamson talk about Ezra and Nehemiah, especially Nehemiah chapter 8, which is all about the representation of the law, a reenactment of Sinai. Yet the tradition persists in ruins in some sense in the book of 4th Ezra. Although it cannot be read or cited for what is explicitly presented as interpretation, Scripture, says Ezra, can be recalled, and ultimately it can be revealed again. Did the intended readers of 4th Ezra feel distant from scriptural traditions, yet not so completely cut off as to be out of reach of its recollected resonances? we have no way of knowing. I already mentioned earlier that Adam is all over the text, Abraham is in the text, David is in the text, Job is in the text. They're not really without the textual traditions. But this is how this writer in the aftermath of the destruction of the Second Temple, chose to engage a time of crisis in which Judaism could not simply continue, but would have to be rebuilt. Eventually, after several centuries, this would give rise to Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism. Both are anticipated in 4th Ezra, and yet neither quite fit neatly into the story of the 1st century. And I would say this also, I'm surrounded by some of the world's most important scholars of the Dead Sea Scrolls this evening. Many of them have struggled to teach and to understand these texts that don't quite fit neatly into one or the other. These are texts that were discovered, uncovered in 11 caves that help us understand the ways in which the Dead Sea Scrolls participate both in the formation of early Rabbinic Judaism and in the emergence of ancient Christianity. Our challenge as scholarly readers of 4th Ezra and, of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls is to read it in light of its own self-presentation, yet with an understanding of the past that it appeals to only under erasure, with an understanding of the multiple possible futures to which is on the way. So it's not the angel or God, but Ezra, our protagonist Ezra, who initiates the final step. Only a human being who feels compassion can exercise leadership and exemplify the possibility of covenantal subjectivity after the destruction. And this is text 12 on your handout. Enjoin your house and teach your people and comfort those that are oppressed and inform the wise ones and abandon, therefore, this life of corruption. I do want to say that this is after many, many verses where Ezra refuses to be comforted by the angel, refuses to be comforted by God, is full of anger and disappointment in God for having allowed the destruction to happen. But he comes to terms with it when he's confronted with the daughter of Zion who is in mourning, right? Mourning like Rachel mourns over, like Rachel mourns over her child that is no more. In the book of Hope in Jeremiah 30:31. Again, an explicit and deliberate rereading of that text. But how shall the comfort and instruction be given? And here we have text 13 on your handout, and this is the very end of the text of 4th Ezra, which I'll let you read while I move towards my concluding sections. This final step in text 13, and then the second slide as well, where you see a representation of the law, a reopening of the text, of both the private and the public text. It's both a representation of Sinai, but it's also a rewriting of nothing else except this text that you've heard both Professor Schiffman and Professor Williamson talk about, Nehemiah 8, this representation of the law on a wooden platform, a Migdal Eitz, which is like a mountain, and the text is revealed again. In the 7th vision, the final vision of this text, 4th Ezra, there's a restoration of the Torah in its textualized form. Perhaps it's enough from an angelic perspective that the law, says Ezra, does not perish but remains in its glory. Perhaps just as the celestial temple continues despite the destruction of its early counterpart, so the Torah persists in heaven, even if it was burnt on earth. But if Israel is to resume its covenantal life with God, and if the people are not to devote their energy to the rebuilding of the temple, then they need not only to focus on the world to come, but also to focus on some feature of the world that's represented by the covenant. And they will need to find a collective way of life that enables salvation, even if it's the salvation of only a few. From our perspective, then, there are many possibilities, including but not exhausted by Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism. Indeed, each of those terms, such as Judaism and Christianity, names a family of ways of life, not a monolithic religion. We don't know very much about the immediate context in which 4th Ezra was written or first read. What I've offered this evening is a lot of scholarly reconstructions to help contextualize it linguistically, theologically, conceptually. But it appears to contain elements which anticipates both Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism without quite fitting into either. The apocalyptic visions, there's a lot of rewritings of Daniel in this work as well, along with their occasional mentions of the Messiah, certainly anticipate many salient features of Christianity, but they're hardly foreign to Rabbinic Judaism either. And their focus on the return of the 10 lost tribes and the divine punishment of Israel's adversaries does not seem particularly Christian or exclusively Christian. Indeed, this is among the arguments made by Jerome and others for the exclusion of 4th Ezra from the Christian canon. The focus on the repetition of the giving of the Torah at Sinai is closer to Rabbinic Judaism, but could also be accommodated within Christianity, as the afterlife of 4th Ezra in some Christian communities illustrate. My conclusion. What is essential about this work of 4th Ezra is that it exemplifies the period of the first century of the Common Era, that a period of tremendous trauma, but also a period of tremendous productivity and tenacity. The 1st and the 2nd century CE was a time where ideas characteristic of Judaism and Christianity emerged. But at a later point, there is a real parting of the ways, so that texts like 4th Ezra will be claimed as Pharisaic or as Christian, or elements of these texts will be claimed as Pharisaic. The truth is that they're both and neither, and that is the essence of our own formation and origins. We participate in traditions that are shared and intimately linked. To aspire to a time, to a period prior to either, is somehow, I think, to miss the forest for the trees. The Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and even the New Testament, are texts and collections that are part of a larger, intertwined tradition of religious traditions that are emerging in an intermingled history, politics, and shared literary heritage. This is exemplified through manuscript traditions, through the reading of shared texts, and fundamentally through a profound commitment to the preservation of the past into a new and uncharted future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In just a minute, we're going to have room for some questions, and then we also have some refreshments that are kosher as well. I think we might all stand up and then see where the questions are. We've got a microphone if we need it. Who would like to ask? So there was Professor Schiffman on Ezra and the Rabbis, Professor Williamson on Ezra as the father of Judaism, and Professor Najman on 4th Ezra.
I could ask a question. I could kick it off.
Yes.
How's that? Okay. So,
Perfect.
Hugh, can I ask you a question? I don't know if I need the mic. Do I need the mic? So what's at stake with the literary figure? In light of what we're saying, I mean, the text I'm writing about, certainly there's no protagonist Ezra. What difference does it make for the history of the formation of Judaism if we're able to identify Ezra as the historical Ezra, or Ezra as a figure, as a mythical figure who comes to represent this very rich tradition that you discussed?
It's a difficult question to answer because we're in the realm of hypothesis here. If he's a historical figure of whom we learn from the text, we can follow that through in a fairly normal way. We can debate the details, but the picture is clear. If he's just a literary figure, as it were, invented by somebody or some people, they are presumably seeking to crystallize in a person what was actually a wider intellectual movement. And that's possible, but intellectual movements are not abstract things. I mean, actually, that people come up with ideas and methods and so on. So if there isn't a historical Ezra, and that's obviously debatable, we've got to kind of hypothesize some other individual or groups who go through the process I tried to describe. Now, people may disagree with that, but I don't think we take sufficiently on board this remarkable fact that the religion of ancient Israel, transformed in many ways, did actually survive and go on. There's no equivalent for that, really, in ancient history. So that had to be done around the time I was talking about, along the lines I was talking about. If we can't link it to a named person, well, we just have to do it and live with the consequences. But it seems a shame to me.
Did you have something to
I,
add?
I want to tell a funny story. So I went to a conference about rabbinic Agadah, the sort of legendary material in rabbinic texts. And there was an assumption throughout the conference that nothing that the texts say the rabbis did, they did, and nothing that they said, they said. So I asked to myself and a few friends the following question. A, if nothing the rabbis said, they said, and nothing that they did could possibly be true, according to these accounts, then the question is A, what did they do all day? And B, how do we get all these texts? Now, I think this is the fundamental problem. Scholars today want to deny the historicity of practically everything. And there are reasons for this which are scholarly trends. But if you take out individuals, then you create a situation in which you have no explanation for events except for something that assumes that events don't need individuals. Now, there are historians who hold that view. But sadly, to some extent, in terms of bad events, and happily in terms of some great events, I think we all see that individual leadership or specific qualities may be key at different points. So if you remove all these people, then now I'm just paraphrasing you. How the heck did these things come about? Obviously, some people had to do them. So what's wrong with believing that the name that was passed down to the person who did it, and some other people, remember there are tremendous lists of names in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah who lived at that time. What's wrong with thinking that those people actually did what someone said that they did?
Thank you. I think Professor Fried had a question.
Well, I just wanted to comment that I just wanted to.
Start off.
I just wanted to comment that the author.
It's on.
I just wanted to comment that the author of For Ezra believed that Ezra started Judaism.
Yeah, you know what's amazing is the protagonist of Ezra and the protagonist Ezra and Fourth Ezra is many different figures. He also identifies himself as Sha'altiel, who's the part of the line of Zerubbabel. He also seems to be identified with a whole bunch of other figures like Daniel, or a better interpreter than Daniel. He becomes, as we already said, and this was already evident in both of your wonderful talks, a new Moses. And this is explicit in Fourth Ezra. So it kind of activates what's already implicit in this literary heritage, and also participates in the history of rabbinic Judaism with respect to the figure of Ezra, even though this text on its own was never transmitted in the history of Judaism. It gets transmitted only along Christian communities.
And some minor ones.
Can I comment on what you both said about these named figures? One thing I find very puzzling is that in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, we have an awful lot of named figures because we have chapters full of genealogies where you just get lists of people's heritage. And what is puzzling me is that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the non-biblical Dead Sea Scrolls, we've got barely any personal names. It tends to be very enigmatic labels, and I wonder how we.
First of all, most of the personal names in the Dead Sea Scrolls are actually in texts that the Bedouins sold as if they were from Qumran, when they actually were from other places. This is part of this whole story that there was a period in the 50s when the Bedouin were stealing scrolls from caves that were under Israeli control and then selling them to the scholars in Jordan as if they had come from Qumran. And that was their excuse to get away with it. Now then, however, here's a very important point. There is one reference in the various Damascus documents to the Perush Motam, the list of their names.
Yes.
It's generally believed by most scholars that there were in that text a list of members of the sect that don't anymore survive, and that these lists, because there's some funny, I don't remember the exact words, there's some funny syntax where you're like missing some words.
Yeah.
And so that was what was there, the original list. So maybe the membership list once existed, but it was thrown away, or something else happened. But you're right in what you said. Now, one more point about these genealogies. These partake of the same tendencies of Chronicles. You know, why does nobody read Chronicles? I don't want to ask who here read Chronicles. Now, the fact is, the fact is, if you start at the beginning of Chronicles, you're faced with, I don't know, what is it, 9 chapters of names? And not only that, these names are people who you never heard of before when you read Genesis and Exodus, right? So the point is, this is a tendency in that period, and I think that tendency may have passed by.
Yeah, I mean, what is the case in the Dead Sea Scrolls is that they're anonymized, right? So they become participants that could be past, could be future, and could be present. And the same can be said about some of these pseudepigraphic texts, these texts that participate in false attribution, saying that it's Moses or saying that it's Ezra, when we know that it wasn't Moses and Ezra. It was composed long after their time, but it's a way of making them timeless. You know, to say that a text, you know, was written by Jeremiah in the first century of the Common Era is to say that it's somehow part of a legacy, it's part of a past, it's part of a future, and it's part of an unnamed present, which gives them access. So the teacher of righteousness can be a teacher from the past, but it can also be for this end time future, the time, primordial time and future time, Kedem.
If I could just put in a word for the genealogies.
Yes.
Clearly, at this period, this was quite common. We have lists of names also in the Torah and so on. But what's interesting is not just the names as lists of names, but the, can I call them patterns, the shape that are given to these, because these are making a very profound point about the nature and the identity of the community. We're living in a time when the community was small, embattled, you know, still trying to find its feet, as it were. And so if you just take Chronicles, you run through from Adam, not to Abraham, although he's mentioned, of course, but to Jacob, the father of the 12 tribes. And then you get the 12 tribes. The first tribe is Judah. The last tribe is Benjamin. The middle tribe is Levi. Now these are the 3 tribes which, to whatever extent historically, were the core of that Judean community. And all the others, Manasseh and Ephraim and others, are enclosed by that. In other words, there's an attempt to say that those who are enclosed by the existing tribes are an inherent part of the community. So they are trying, I think, to make an important point about who's in and who's out in ways that resonate, because these are family names that one can identify with.
But you've written about this as well as Gary Coppers, about the ways in which genealogies are themselves creative narratives, part of this literary heritage of which you spoke, but also these are narratives, the genealogies themselves are narratives that reconstruct a past in very particular, politically charged, creative and interpretive ways.
Now, we have been at our conference for a very long day, and we've really enjoyed coming out, and we will be staying for refreshments, but I think we're going to stop the sort of formal discussion now because it's quite late. But thank you so much, and if you've enjoyed it, we've recorded it, you can recommend it once this is out on the internet, and please enjoy our refreshments.